This is the story of David and Goliath, one boy, one stone, one impossible battle. When faith stands before fear, giants fall. Long ago, there was once peace in the land of Israel. The days were calm, the nights were quiet, and the people felt safe beneath the rule of their first king, Saul. He was strong, tall, and chosen by God to lead his people. Under his reign, the fields of Israel thrived, families grew, and the songs of worship echoed across the valleys. But peace, as it often does, began to fade. Beyond the distant hills, a storm was gathering. The Philistines, longtime enemies of Israel, were on the move again, an army vast and ruthless, their weapons made of iron, their warriors seasoned and fierce. Among them was a man whose very name inspired terror, Goliath of Gath, a giant towering above all others, his armor glimmering like bronze in the sun. News of the Philistines' approach spread quickly. Fear crept into every home. King Saul rallied his army and marched toward the valley of Elah, where two ridges of land faced each other with a stream cutting through the middle, a natural battlefield. There, the fate of Israel would soon be decided. For 40 days, the armies stood at a standoff. Each morning, Goliath strode forward from the Philistine camp, his booming voice echoing across the valley. He taunted Israel, daring them to send a single warrior to fight him one-on-one. If Israel's champion won, the Philistines would serve them, but if Goliath prevailed, Israel would become their slaves. His words carried pride, mockery, and confidence born from countless victories. But among Saul's men, no one stepped forward. Not one. Even Saul himself, though once brave, felt his courage fading. The army that once sang of God's power now trembled in silence. Meanwhile, miles away in the quiet town of Bethlehem, an old man named Jesse lived with his 8 sons. His older sons had already gone to join Saul's army, leaving behind their youngest brother, David. David was a shepherd, still in his youth, with no armor, no title, and no experience in war. His days were spent in the hills, guiding his father's sheep, playing music on his harp, and whispering songs of praise beneath the stars. Yet, in those peaceful fields, his faith was being forged. When danger came, David never ran. Once, a lion attacked his flock, another time, a bear. Each time, he stood firm, trusting that the God who created the heavens would also protect him in the wilderness. And each time, he prevailed, not by might, but by faith. It was this same quiet strength that would one day move mountains. One morning, Jesse called David and handed him a small task that would change his life forever. He asked him to bring food to his brothers and check on their well-being at the battlefield. It seemed ordinary, just a simple errand of love. But God often hides great purposes inside small responsibilities. So David rose before sunrise, packed bread and grain, and began his journey toward the valley of Elah. The road was dusty and long, winding between rocky hills and golden fields. The closer he came, the more he could feel the tension in the air, the heavy stillness that always comes before a battle. As David approached Saul's camp, he heard shouting. The Israelites were rushing to their positions, armor clanging, voices full of fear and confusion. He climbed a small ridge and looked down into the valley below, and what he saw would be etched into his heart forever. Across the valley, standing tall and terrible, was Goliath. His armor flashed like fire under the morning sun. The spear in his hand looked like a weaver's beam, the iron tip alone weighing as much as a man's arm. Every word that left his mouth was filled with mockery and arrogance. Israel's soldiers stood frozen, unable to answer his challenge. And in that moment, as David watched from afar, something stirred deep within him, a holy fire, a righteous boldness. Not anger, not pride, but a fierce conviction that God's name must not be mocked. While others saw an unbeatable enemy, David saw an opportunity for God's glory. He could not understand how an army that belonged to the living God could be paralyzed by fear. Faith rose within him like a tide, and without realizing it, his path was set. It was unthinkable, a shepherd boy volunteering to fight a warrior who had never lost. But David's heart was steady. He remembered the lion. He remembered the bear. He remembered every moment God had come through for him when no one else could. So he made a decision: if no one else would defend God's honor, then he would. While soldiers whispered and laughed, he prepared himself, not with armor, not with weapons of iron, but with trust. He walked down to the stream that cut through the valley and picked up 5 smooth stones, turning each one over in his palm, feeling their weight. They weren't special or shining, they were simple, ordinary, just like him. Yet in the hands of faith, even ordinary things become mighty. The sun burned high above as David stepped forward. The valley grew still. The Philistines shouted and mocked, but their voices faded into the background. All that existed in David's mind was the quiet certainty that the God who had never failed him would not start now. Across the field, Goliath began to move, each step shaking the ground beneath him. His shadow stretched long over the valley floor, swallowing the light. Any man would have turned and fled, but David kept walking, steady and sure. The world watched as 2 figures drew closer, one, a giant covered in armor and pride, the other, a boy armed with nothing but faith and a sling. It was not an equal fight. By human standards, it was impossible. But David was not relying on human strength. He was walking with divine confidence, a calm assurance that victory belonged to God alone. The moment came like the breaking of a storm. Goliath raised his weapons, the Philistines roared. On the other side, Israel held its breath. Then, silence. David reached into his pouch, pulled out 1 smooth stone, and placed it in his sling. The leather cord stretched tight as he swung it through the air, faster and faster, until his whole body moved with precision born from years in the fields. The sling released. The stone flew. Time seemed to slow, the air trembling, hearts pounding, eyes fixed on what would happen next. And then, impact. The stone struck Goliath squarely on the forehead. The giant's body stiffened, his towering form wavered like a great tree in the wind. For a moment, he stood still, then fell forward, crashing into the dust. The earth shook beneath him. The giant lies motionless, face down in the dirt, his bronze armor glinting faintly under the sun. David steps closer, lifts Goliath's massive sword with both hands, and raises it high, a symbol of triumph, faith, and divine victory. The valley was silent. The impossible had happened. The boy had defeated the giant. At first, no one moved. Then, one shout broke the stillness, a cry of awe and triumph that spread like fire through the ranks of Israel. Soldiers who had been paralyzed by fear now lifted their swords high, their courage reignited. They surged forward, shouting with new strength, driving the Philistines back in terror. The enemy fled, their pride shattered, their champion gone. The victory belonged not to sword or spear, but to faith, faith in a God who never abandons his people, even when all seems lost. As the echoes of battle faded, Israel rejoiced. The valley that had once been filled with fear was now filled with songs of victory. The people looked to the young shepherd who had faced the impossible and triumphed, and they saw more than courage, they saw God's power made visible through the heart of one believer. David's journey didn't end that day. It was only the beginning. The victory over Goliath opened doors to a destiny he could never have imagined. A path that would lead him to the throne of Israel, to triumphs and trials, to songs of worship and seasons of brokenness. But his greatest victory would always be that moment when he chose faith over fear. That single choice changed everything. Because courage is not the absence of fear, it is the decision to trust God in the midst of it. The story of David and Goliath is more than a tale of war. It is the story of every person who has ever stood before something that seemed too big, too powerful, too impossible to overcome. We all face giants, not always with swords or shields, but with struggles that tower over us, fear, doubt, failure, sickness, rejection, or despair. They mock us, whispering that we can't win, that we're too small, too weak, too late. But like David, we are called to look beyond the size of the giant and see the greatness of our God. The same God who stood with David in that valley stands with us now. The same hand that guided a single stone guides our steps today. Faith doesn't always make sense. It rarely feels safe. But it moves mountains. It slays giants. It changes everything. David didn't win because he was stronger. He won because he believed. And when you believe, truly believe, no giant can stand in your way. So when fear rises, remember this, God still fights for those who trust him. You don't need armor made of iron, you need a heart anchored in faith. You don't need the strength of the world, you need the courage to take one step forward. One boy. One stone. One moment of faith. That's all it took to change a nation. In the end, David's victory wasn't just about a fallen giant, it was about a restored faith. Israel rediscovered what it meant to trust God completely. And David discovered what it meant to walk boldly in divine purpose. Your story may not unfold on a battlefield, but the same truth applies: when you step out in faith, God steps in with power. So whatever stands before you today, however impossible it may seem, remember the valley of Elah. Remember the boy who believed when no one else would. Remember the God who turned weakness into victory. Because when faith stands before fear, giants fall.